After Alexander the Great died, what happened to his kingdom? It split into how many kind of sub-kingdoms? 4 of them. Only 2 of them really matter to us. And that's the kingdom of Syria and the kingdom of Egypt. And that kind of translated into the Seleucid kingdom and the Ptolemaic kingdom. So up first, the Jews were under the Ptolemies. They were under the power of the Ptolemies. And by and large, in this period, which we're talking about somewhere around 100 years, maybe just a little bit more, they basically were able to just kind of live their lives. So the status quo was kind of kept. But all the while, during this period of time, in essence from 300 BC to 200 BC, the whole Hellenistic culture began to encroach. When we look at representations of these Ptolemaic rulers, this was Ptolemy the First, you're already starting to see kind of what in the representations here? They look like what? They look like Egypt. They look like the old pharaohs, basically. But when you look at other ones, they appear more normal, at least like other world rulers of the times. They even, of course, the Ptolemaic rulers had their own coins that were minted. But this was a time where the Jews were able to essentially kind of live in peace. Now, that didn't always stay the case. And in Daniel chapter 11, and I didn't really put a lot of this in Daniel chapter 11, but because we looked at from the standpoint of as we went through this with our young men, we actually went through all of the book of Daniel. So the lessons in between the testaments didn't refer to it because I didn't need for it to refer to it. But what happens in Daniel chapter 11? Does anyone know? We talked about Daniel 2 last time and Daniel 7. So Daniel 2 is the what of Nebuchadnezzar? The dream of the statue, and that statue represented 4 world kingdoms. Then we get to Daniel chapter 7, and that's Daniel's what? That's Daniel's vision. And Daniel has this vision, and the vision is similar to the statue. It's at least it's similar in idea to the statue, but of course it's radically different. But Daniel does dream of a part, or Daniel does have a vision of a part of the Grecian period. So in this Grecian period, as it divides into the different kingdoms, we move to Daniel chapter 11. And what does Daniel chapter 11 do with us? Daniel chapter 11 tells us what happened in what time period? In the time period of what we're talking about now. If you'll notice in Daniel chapter 11, the first few verses, of course, talk about what circumstance? Alexander the Great and his what? Kingdom that divides. And then for a lot of verses, you have essentially what appears to be kind of 2 antagonists. A king of the what? North, and the king of the south. There are a lot of prophecies. And as you're noticing in each one of those verses, you may have 4 or 5 phrases, and each one of those phrases is a little nugget of prophecy. So you get all the way down to where this begins to kind of turn, as we're going to take it kind of about in verse 31 or so. So for all of this period of time, you have prophecies between the king of the north and the king of the south. The king of the north is the Seleucid kingdom. The king of the south is the Ptolemaic kingdom. So the Syrians versus the Egyptians. And there's all kinds of intrigue. In fact, as war breaks out between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, let me just kind of give you, and you've got this in your notes, but war breaks out when Berenice, who was Ptolemy's daughter, had been murdered with her son through the intrigue of Laodice, the half-sister and the wife of Antiochus II, who was the Syrian leader. So it was, if you will, and I don't mean to make light of it, but it was just all of this drama that was taking place, this intrigue that takes place, and that puts the two kingdoms at war with one another, often referred to as the Laodicean War. And it was just a tussle back and forth. And again, Palestine was in the wrong kind of area because it lay in between the two of them. So I'd shown you the rulers of the Ptolemies last time, so let's just kind of go through the rulers of the Seleucid kingdom. You will notice that they were either called Seleucus or Antiochus. Really, we're going to kind of advance to Antiochus the third, because he's going to be the one that will be important for us for the next few moments, because Antiochus the third had two sons. One of them was Seleucus the fourth. As you can see, that wasn't an extremely important reign, but this one right here is the big one. Antiochus the fourth, or Epiphanes. Antiochus the fourth, or Epiphanes, is the one that begins being spoken of in the last part of Daniel chapter 11. This is the one who basically changed all of the Jewish culture and began to turn it toward the Hellenist, or those who were the supporters of the Greek culture. We go on down, we pick up Demetrius. So Demetrius begins to be a name a little bit later on. But finally we end with Antiochus Asiaticus all the way down to 65 BC. At that point, what takes place in 65 BC? That's when the Romans come in, exactly. So again, I mentioned that we were looking at, just backing up, these first rulers here, Seleucus, Antiochus the first and the second, Seleucus the second and the third, but really it's this Antiochus the third. And that's where things began to get a little bit interesting. So kind of moving ahead to the ideas of the Jews under these Seleucids, Antiochus the third was only 18 years old when he began to reign. Only 18 years old when he began to reign. Here's some of the coinage that was minted of Antiochus the third. Antiochus the third began a campaign to try to get Palestine from the Ptolemies, from the Egyptian kingdom. And this was like most world kingdoms. The world kingdoms are constantly trying to do what? Take another part of the land. You know, a world kingdom is there, essentially, to try to grow larger. Because if you're not growing larger, what's happening to you? You're getting smaller. If your world empire isn't getting larger and larger, then you've reached the point where you can't advance. Once you reach the point where you can't advance, then all the other nations start coming in and doing what? Kind of pulling apart all of your empire. At this point, Antiochus III definitely was trying and moving to enlarge the Seleucid Empire. And I showed you a picture of it last week. It becomes pretty enormous. The Seleucid Empire reaches all the way from Asia Minor into the region of beyond Babylon and kind of encroaching into the region of India. Antiochus III goes to Syria, where he is unfortunately assassinated. He makes Seleucus IV his son. Seleucus IV is assassinated by his brother, who has Antiochus IV. And again, Antiochus IV, or Epiphanes, is where a whole new era of Jewish history begins. So, what made Antiochus IV so diabolical? Yes. Antiochus IV was the one who basically changed everything. So his name was Epiphanes, which meant the illustrious Epiphanes. The Jews called him Epiphanes. And Epiphanes meant the madman. So Antiochus Epiphanes kind of took the Jews that were already trying to lean toward the Hellenistic culture, and basically he just ran with it. Here's some of the things that he did. He ordered the worship of Zeus as their supreme god. So the temple essentially had a structure, an idol, a large statue of Zeus. This is supposedly a pretty good likeness of it. He makes the worship of Zeus as the supreme god. He also destroyed the city of Jerusalem because of the resistance. Greek soldiers performed licentious heathen rites in the temple courts. Swine were sacrificed on the altar. Jews were forced to eat swine's flesh under the reign of Antiochus IV. A drunken orgy associated with the worship of Dionysus or Bacchus was made. That was made compulsory. The Jews were forbidden under penalty of death to observe or to practice circumcision, the Sabbath, the feast of the Jewish years. Copies of the Hebrew Scriptures were all burned. And so when you've got this kind of assault on everything that was good to them, ultimately what's going to eventually happen? If you push and push and push, that you are going to have rebellion. And that's exactly what we're moving toward, was rebellion against the Syrian rule of the Jewish people. But kind of while this is going on, and before we actually get to this, I want us to talk just for a few minutes about the impact of Hellenism on the Jews. Now, what was Hellenism? It was the acceptance of Greek culture. And I want you to remember that no matter if the Egyptians were in control or the Syrians were in control, no matter if it was the kingdom of the south or the kingdom of the north, the culture was always Greek. So it didn't matter. The Jews had that constant pressure there, no matter who was in power. And it was a tremendous pressure. And one of the interesting parts about studying the intertestamental period is the fact that these Jews were now all of a sudden facing a culture that was very, very different than what they were used to. And you see the reaction to it, and the reaction's going to be a violent reaction. But let's talk just a little bit about the observations of Hellenism. So Alexander the Great, I had told you that Alexander the Great had a very famous teacher. Who was it? Who was the teacher of Aristotle? And if you'll remember, it was Socrates, then Plato, then Aristotle. Aristotle was kind of the last one of the three great philosophers. That was Alexander the Great's teacher. So Alexander, as he went around conquering different lands, I told you that he was trying to kind of instill cities of Greek culture all over the places that he conquered. Probably the best known one, some people argue it was the best example completely, was that of Alexandria. So where was Alexandria? Alexandria was in Egypt. Okay? Alexandria was in Egypt. And what was Alexandria known for? Its library, yes. So many volumes. I think somewhere on the neighborhood of 25,000 different volumes. And earlier rulers had actually moved some of the Jews to Alexandria. So there became kind of a pretty decent Jewish community in Alexandria. And that's going to make for some very, very interesting things. Now, Hellenism, as far as just a culture was concerned, even though it did have elements that were definitely unrighteous, It wasn't all bad, nor was it, of course, all good. It just was what it was. But there was always this pressure for the Jews to change, and they were ultimately going to resist it. One of the greatest, and I think you could easily call it the greatest of all of the things that happened, is how it spread the Jews all over the place. After the Babylon captivity, and we talked about the people that came back. So how many people came back? Do you remember what the rough number was? In the time of Ezra, of course you had the first return, that was the biggest one, Joshua and Zerubbabel. Then you had Ezra, then you had Nehemiah. How many people in the end returned? About 50,000. You remember that? About 50,000. And even though 50,000 had come back, pretty much after the Babylonian captivity, you never had the majority of the Jews living back in Palestine again. They were literally spread all over the place. They were in Babylon. They stayed in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. They were in Syria, in Antioch, in Damascus. They were also over in Asia Minor, which meant Lydia, Phrygia, Ephesus, Pergamum, Sardis. So historically speaking, this dispersion is what takes us into the New Testament, where you've got the New Testament prophets and apostles going all over the then known world. And what were they finding all over the then known world? Jews. I mean, everywhere Paul went, what did he do? He preached to the Jews first. So, Hellenism in a big way was actually very, very good for the Jews. They were able to amass tremendous wealth. They were able to become a part of Greek culture. The Jews were able to have a Greek education. The Scriptures, we'll talk about here in just a second, was able to make a deep, deep impact in the world then at that time. So it had some good points to it. But this is someone's speculation, I guess, best way to say it, on what the Library at Alexandria would have looked like. And then as we kind of move into considering the Septuagint and talking about the Septuagint for a second, here's some of the pictures of what this Septuagint would have looked like and some of the pieces of the Septuagint that have been recovered from it. A roll here, or a scroll, of what this Septuagint would have been. So what was the Septuagint? What was the Septuagint? Right. Translation of the Old Testament into the Greek. Why was that so important? Why was that so important? At this point, the Old Testament was only in what? Was only in Hebrew. It is what would be called the Masoretic text. The Masoretes were kind of a subsection of scribes who took very, very great care in copying over the Scriptures, but it was still, nevertheless, very, very Hebrew. So as Hellenism began to spread all over the world, what did people want? They wanted, because they spoke Greek, they wanted a Bible in the Greek language. So it's theorized, why was it called the Septuagint? Supposedly, this was Ptolemy. This was Ptolemy who had sent a delegation to the high priest in Jerusalem. Now, remember, does anyone know about what time the Septuagint was produced? We don't have an exact year, but does anyone know? So we kind of stopped. I kind of paused at Antiochus Epiphanes. What the Septuagint was probably produced 100 years before that. So now when we've kind of paused and we've went backwards just a little bit in time, we've gone backwards pretty much to the time when Alexander's kingdom splits into 4 different pieces. And that's when the Septuagint has been worked on. So Ptolemy, Palestine's now under control of the Ptolemies at the very beginning. Ptolemy sends a delegation to Alexandria to try to get them to make this copy of the Hebrew Scriptures. And supposedly, there were 6 different scribes, 6 different experts that came from each one of the 12 tribes. So it ended up being 72, and that's why it's called the Septuagint. Now, we don't know if that actually was true or if it turned out to be somewhat of myth or legend, but as far as we know, that was true. What impact did the Septuagint have on the world? What impact did the Septuagint have on the world? So first of all of the Jews now had access, if they had been born and raised in this Hellenistic culture, because let me tell you, learning Hebrew is hard. It's a hard language. So as these children were getting more exposed to this new language with this new culture, learning Hebrew was very, very difficult. They could have a copy of the Scriptures that they could read, but keep thinking. Who else could have a copy of Scriptures that they could read? The non-Jews, Gentiles. So by the time that we get to the New Testament, and I think it's 8 different times, there's a word that's used. Cornelius was the first, I believe, in Acts chapter 10. What was Cornelius? He was a proselyte. Now, some versions call him a proselyte. The newer versions call him a proselyte. The older versions call him a what? Does anyone know? And it's put 2 different ways. Either a fearer of God or a God-fearer. What was a God-fearer? A proselyte. A proselyte. Now, what was a proselyte? It was a Gentile converted to Judaism. Now, they couldn't convert all of the way. And from what I've read about proselytism, there were different levels of it, as you might imagine. A Gentile could never become a full-fledged what? Jew. That wasn't possible. But there were different levels of kind of proselytes that you had. And to my understanding, a God-fearer was pretty much as close as you could be to an actual Jew. And that's what Cornelius was. And again, the term's used several different times in the New Testament. So not only could the Jews have now access to the Old Testament in a language that they were learning, but other people, Gentiles, could have that access to the copies of the Scriptures. But then there's another reason, and it's a big reason. What did the Septuagint essentially do? What did the Septuagint do? Now think about New Testament times. Think about New Testament times. The New Testament has a lot of what from the Old Testament? Has a lot of what? Has a lot of quotes. Does anyone know how many quotes? I don't know the exact number. It's over 300. So the New Testament uses the Old Testament over 300 times. For example, when we get to Matthew in just a few weeks, Matthew has over 50 of them. Okay? Most of the time, they're quoting from what? The Septuagint. Now again, I've tried to look at estimates of how much is the Septuagint used. And I've basically come across a couple of numbers. One number says that the Septuagint was used about 2/3 of the time, and another number said that the Septuagint was used about 90% of the time. So the Septuagint left this indelible mark on the New Testament that now has essentially changed the face of the New Testament. And it also kind of gives us an offhanded authority. I don't want to say. It's also kind of given us offhanded capability for us to do what? For us to do what? We don't study anything in the original language. I mean, I've learned a little bit of New Testament Greek. Grayson's going to learn a little bit of New Testament Greek. It was with every generation that was changing. So that Hebrew, the acceptance of all of the children being able to speak Hebrews was moving away in the intertestamental times. Now, there were some communities of it, and we didn't even get to talk about the Hasidim this morning, but we will next week. The Hasidim was a very, very strong Orthodox group. Okay? So they would have likely have taught their children and been very fastidious in teaching their children the ancient language of Hebrew. But a lot of them, and I would venture to say most of them, as the generations were going on, didn't learn that biblical Hebrew. So they had to rely on a what? Which was they had to rely on the translation of the Septuagint. So what does that kind of offhandedly make okay for us? The fact that we have to what? Use a translation. Use a translation. Which means that for us to be true, proper New Testament Christians, we don't have to what? We don't have to know Greek or Hebrew, because Jesus used a Greek version of the Old Testament. I can use an English version of the New Testament. Now again, I don't want to say biblical authority in the sense of biblical authority, because that's not what I mean by that. But it is a very, very intriguing example in the fact that these people used what was available to them at the time and what they in the culture in which they were living, and they used that to then further what they were doing and writing. And for whatever it's worth, I see that as being acceptable for me to do the exact same, which is to use English translations of these old languages to understand the will of God. Let's just talk just a second now for Hellenism in Palestine. So Hellenism in Palestine, not only did, of course, we have the Septuagint, but Hellenism in Palestine, the Jews were kind of enamored by the Greek way of life. Those who were younger, it was a big change. It was very different. It was kind of the spirit of the age, this new Greek Hellenistic culture. So you can kind of imagine that, especially with young people, what do you think it did? It really, really took off. So the educated classes, especially enamored with the Greek way of life. The amphitheater, the gymnasiums, there were, of course, the understanding that it was a threat to the Jewish way of life. We get to really dive into that next time in the last part of this particular lesson. But you had people constantly who were fighting it. And I brought up the Hasidim. So let me just tell you about the Hasidim real quick. The Hasidim meant the pious. These were the Orthodox Jews. I mean, the people who were really going to try to hold the line to Old Testament Hebrew ways. They were going to fight this Hellenizing culture, and it's the fighting is going to break out after what Antiochus IV did in changing so much around the temple in Jerusalem. It was going to break out in fighting. But here were the Hasidim trying to kind of hold the line. The Hasidim, most scholars believe, were the precursors of who? The Pharisees. The Pharisees. And now today, I've used this word already, but today Judaism is kind of broken down into different sections. And the section that tries to stay the closest to the Torah, which we'll explain by the time the class ends, but the one that stays the closest to the Torah, what are they called today? The Orthodox. The Orthodox. So the Hasidim were the Orthodox. Again, kind of the precursors of the Pharisees. Next time, we will look at the Maccabean revolt, and that's what began to change Judaism as we know it.